All right. Did you make it to the end of the questions? Did anyone make it through question 8? Anyone make it through 8? Oh, then we have to ask. I think Barb Carew was going to answer it for us. What do you think, so this chapter talks about Paul and Corinth, and it has this discussion with Gallio, and then he returns to Antioch, and eventually it tells the story of Apollos. But why is a chapter, what's the point of a chapter like this? What is it trying to do? To teach us how to spread the gospel. How so?
We go to everyone.
We go to everyone. That would be part of it, yeah. What else?
I think maybe just the fact that he had the help from all the other people.
Paul had help from all of these other people. Yeah, say more about that. That's good.
Well, just like you need help with some of your things that you need to do because you don't have time for everything. So that's where comes in, or Paul comes in, or whatever. So I think that's the case with this chapter, that he had the help.
So that Paul had help from other people, that there's more than just him at work. Yeah, I think that's a great point. Anyone else?
Well, it's hard, but he keeps on doing it. He's encouragement from God.
That Paul perseveres in the midst of trials, and he gets some encouragement from the Lord, right? He has this vision. What does that tell us is most likely about Paul?
Maybe he was getting frustrated.
He could have been getting frustrated. My suspicion is that he was becoming kind of discouraged. He keeps trying to reach out to the Jews, and it goes about as well as throwing rocks at, something that's going smoothly, right? It's not a smooth process. So Paul seems to get discouraged, or at least need some encouragement. And that's important. I think that's another great point that Angie makes, because we don't think of St. Paul as getting discouraged. Do you? We've sort of lionized Paul into this great missionary, and he is a great missionary. And we've made him into this figure who is considered to be a founder of the city of Rome, like Peter and Paul. That's why their statues are all over if you go there. But at the same time, Paul is a human. He is working on holiness. He's doing great things for the Lord, but he's still human. And he gets a bit discouraged. So I think that's a part of it as well. He gets help from people. He is encouraged by the Lord. Like Barb said, preaching the gospel to people is important, and that we shouldn't give up, that it requires some perseverance. Some of you don't practice this when it comes to Bible study. You start reading, and it's difficult, and you say, I'll let Father Keller explain it. And you see, St. Paul is telling you that you have to put your nose to the grindstone and stick to it. You have to persevere, because even if you feel like you're not getting the message very well, it is the gospel, it is the scriptures at least. It's not a gospel, but close enough. And Scripture has an ability to speak to us and to our hearts. So you have to put that lesson into practice. That it's not always going to be apparent the first time. Anything else from this chapter? I mean, this is one of those that there aren't necessarily a lot of right answers, but there aren't a lot of wrong answers either. It's meant to be more like, how does it speak to you? What does it say to you? And that's important, because actually this chapter is relatively short. So St. Paul heads to Corinth, And Corinth is on the island of? No, Greece is a country, not an island. Corinth is on the island of Achaia. That one's mentioned several times. It is in Greece, and it's not too far from Athens. Corinth has a port. Did anyone catch what the port city's name is? Cenchreae, or Chencreae, or something like that. Why does Corinth have a port? You have to think about this. What's the purpose of a port? Trade. It's where ships dock. So if Corinth has a port, what does it mean about Corinth?
A lot of people come from different countries.
It's busy and a lot of people come. That's part of it. But there's something that we know a little bit more directly. If it has a port, it's not on the water itself. Because if it was on the water, you don't have a port city linked to it. If you've been to Rome, Rome is the same way. The port is called Ostia, and it's on the coast, about 7 miles or so south and west of Rome. Corinth is the same way, that because Corinth has a port, we know that it's actually not on the coast itself. Now, the modern city of Corinth is probably a blob, and if you look at a modern map, it probably stretches out to the water. But in the ancient world, for major cities, you were on a body of water, because water is much more efficient to transport goods and people than over land is. And so almost all the places, almost all of the towns and cities in the ancient world, even in the not so ancient world, the medieval world, were on rivers or on the ocean itself, because they would use boats to move things back and forth. You can load a boat with a lot more stuff than you can load a horse or a caravan. So ports are a major part of the story. And that tells us a bit about Corinth. So he heads there after Athens. This is an important commercial city in southern Greece. Now, Athens is known for what? We talked about this last time. And it's sort of classically known for several things. Athens is known for, it isn't in the notes. You won't find it. Who lived in Athens? Who are some of our famous peoples? Socrates and Aristotle and Plato. They're all philosophers. Athens is this place of kind of learning, of philosophy. Has anyone heard of Sophocles? What did Sophocles write? Greek drama. Like plays. They were famous for plays, for theater, for poetry, for philosophy. Athens is kind of like the artistic city. Corinth, on the other hand, is not Athens. Corinth is a different kind of place. What does he compare Corinth to in the reading? Las Vegas. Corinth is, in Greek, they had a word called Korinthiazomai, which means to Corinthianize. And it actually serves the same function in English that vandalism does. What is vandalism? Destruction of things, right? That's how we usually define it. Like rioting, vandalism, that kind of thing. But that's actually not where the word comes from. Vandalism comes from behaving like a vandal. And the Vandals were a group of rather grouchy, Viking-like people that thought that the best way to conquer things was to burn them to the ground. And they invaded Spain and then North Africa. They end up being the group of people that besieges Hippo, where Augustine dies, and many of the other places in North Africa were attacked by the Vandals. And the memory of that was so strong that it actually enters the vocabulary in the word vandalism, to behave like a vandal. That was a group of people. But that's the same kind of thing that happens to Corinth. Corinth has such a strong reputation. It's such a place of dissolution that they make a verb out of it. Like, you know, if you had a child who was misbehaving, you'd call them a Corinthian. That's what it's saying. If you have a child who's doing well at school, you might call them an Athenian, like they're from Athens. But if you're Corinthian, you're not living the life of the gospel, you're living a life of dissolution. And part of that is probably because of the cosmopolitan nature of the city. It was connected to trade, and in the case of the ancient world, they would say that means all the slime from everywhere collects there. They say the same thing about Rome. All the roads lead to Rome, and so it's like the garbage pit of the empire. But in this case, Corinth is probably a much larger city than Athens. That it's more prosperous, that it's more connected to trade. So Paul arrives there. It's famous for living this dissolute lifestyle, and he meets Aquila and Priscilla. The word in English is often said Aquila, but if you look in a good text, the accent is on the first letter. Anyone know what Aquila means? No, you're close. That's aqua. This is Aquila. And Aquila is an eagle. So,
Sunday readings by the Acts of the Corinthians, is that
what was that? The Sunday readings?
when it says from the Acts of the Corinthians?
From the first letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians, or the second letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians. So what happens is Paul goes there on this journey, this second missionary journey. He's going to be in Corinth for a while, and then he sails back to Syria and Antioch. But after that journey, at some point, probably in his third missionary journey, he writes a series of letters back to the churches and that he had visited before. And that's where many of these documents in the New Testament come from. So St. Paul writes his first letter to the Corinthians from Ephesus, and his second letter to the Corinthians from Macedonia, I think. So it's not, those letters are kind of describing or addressing issues that have arisen in the Corinthian church, but probably after he was there. Like he leaves for a while, and then he's on his way back, and he writes these letters to the church in Corinth. And he does the same thing for Thessalonica and Philippi and many of the other cities that he visited. The Galatia, I think those churches were like Iconium, Lystra, Derbe. I think those are all in Galatia as far as a region. So sometimes he wrote letters to a region, and he actually says in a couple of them, like, take this letter and send it to your neighboring churches. And the early churches begin to exchange letters, the writings of the apostles in a sense. And that's part of what forms the foundation of the New Testament. That people who knew Jesus, eyewitnesses, were writing their recollections. And the most famous, the most accurate of these eventually get collected into the four Gospels that we have. And then there were this series of other writings from apostles that end up as part of the New Testament. And a lot of them are these letters that were being sent from one church to another church. Like St. Paul will write a letter to the Romans, probably sometime after he visits Rome for the first time. The end of his life isn't as clear. He seems to have gone to Rome, and then by tradition, it doesn't say it very well, but by tradition he actually ends up going all the way to Spain and then coming back to Rome, that he visits southern Spain. So Aquila and Priscilla are two Jews, and they're from Rome. Why did they end up in Corinth? They got kicked out of Rome because of Claudius, who kicks the Jews out of Rome because something happens. They get into a fight about Chrestus, which almost all historians with a brain think is a misspelling, or the name Christus, like Jesus as the Christ. Is Jesus the Christ or not? This fight that St. Paul gets into with the Jewish people in the synagogues that he visits, the Jews in Rome end up in a fight about this Christus, and it must have been some acrimony because the emperor finally gets tired of it and throws them all out of Rome. So they migrate to Corinth. And Aquila and Priscilla and Paul are all tent makers. So they go to making tents, which probably involves a lot of sewing. Like, they get animal skins and sew them together. Some of them could be colorful, like those of you that printed the color version of the picture on the front. You can see that they have it colorful. This is definitely an artistic representation. Don't take it as like dyed-in-the-wool accurate. It could be, but it's also very possible that there's a little bit of interpretation going on. But they're all tent makers. So Paul, at least when he comes to Corinth, is working during the week. He's working as a tent maker. And then on the weekends, he preaches in the synagogue. He goes to the synagogue. And it's very, very possible in his letter to the Corinthians, he talks about how he doesn't come with a high rhetorical style. He doesn't come to awe them with his ability to speak. He preaches Christ crucified. He dives right to the cross. And it's a little bit of commentary, like if you're having a debate at a university, you have to sound like you're at the university. If you sound like a farmer, the university people just look down their nose at you. You know, who are you to tell us what's going on? Now, the farmer, in some cases, could be very accurate. There's a lot of them that are very intelligent. But they kind of look down their noses because he sounds like he grew up in a barn, probably because he did. But that's kind of what happens here. When Paul is in Athens, he seems to use like the Athenian rhetorical style, which was big and flowery and poetic, grand speeches in the center of town. And at Corinth, he preaches Christ and Christ crucified. And that's a fantastic message because it's something that we return to again and again, that Christianity is a religion that runs by way of the cross. It invites us to die to ourselves, to leave behind the way of pride, the way of sin, to die to the old world. All of that runs by the way of the cross. Christianity is a religion of suffering. It doesn't all work out better all the time. In the end, it does. In the long run, the Lord is able to work through things. But Good Friday doesn't look good when you're on it. It only looks good when you look back at it from Easter. Otherwise, it looks like defeat. So Christianity is a religion that runs by the cross. It seems to be what St. Paul is preaching about in Corinth. And I would suggest to you that as we look at this time in Corinth, a great text to read is like Paul's first letter to the Corinthians. See what he says about his time there and what he talks about. He addresses some of the moral issues of the city quite strongly in terms that are very familiar to us today. Corinth wasn't all that different than modern day America as far as morality goes. They were pretty loose cannons. So he goes to the synagogue on the Sabbath day. He preaches there sort of week after week to Jewish people and also to some Greek people. They could be God-fearing, so they could be Greeks who came to the synagogue as well. That's kind of one category that has come up in the book of Acts repeatedly. It could be that he's begun to preach to the Gentiles somewhat too, especially in his tent making, in his business. And then Silas and Timothy arrive. I'm not sure exactly where they come from. I forget, but it seems like he must have left them in Macedonia, in northern Greece, before he went on his journey toward Athens. Because he got kicked out, or he left, but they didn't seem to have aroused as much suspicion. And they must bring something, because after they arrive, Paul stops tent making and begins to preach full time. He begins to spend his time preaching and teaching and leading the church. And so it's very possible that they brought money or resources with them from the churches in Macedonia, so that he was able to preach full time. He is telling people that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. And he has this he uses this image of a sentinel. And this comes out of ancient Israel. Like God had warned the prophets, if I tell you to go talk to the people and you don't do it, you're responsible, not them. It's your fault. I told you to go and you didn't go. That's on you. If I told you to go and you went and they didn't listen to you, that's on them. You did your job. You did my will. You were supposed to go and you were supposed to teach, but if they don't respond, that's their responsibility. And Paul sort of sees himself in this kind of role, and he says, well, I have done this. I have preached the gospel. You didn't want to listen, so, he shakes the dust off of his feet, and he's like, from now on, I'm going to the Gentiles. Now, he doesn't really do that in the way that the English sounds. He doesn't abandon Jewish people forever. In fact, he'll still go into the synagogue quite frequently, but he doesn't seem to spend the same amount of energy there. He preaches to them, and if they don't listen, he goes to the Gentiles more readily afterwards. But he's using this image of a sentinel, that he has fulfilled his responsibility. And I think that's important. Jesus says, to him who has, more will be given. But the one who has more is also responsible for more. When you enter into the life of grace, there is a lot more to it. It's beautiful, and it's an incredible thing to live life with the Lord. But you also become more responsible for listening to Him. So you don't expect a 2-year-old to grasp the gospel all that well because they're 2. On the other hand, if you have a 15-year-old, you expect them to listen to you, to hear what you have to say. That's kind of what Paul is saying, that he has preached, he has done what God has asked him to do, and so he's not responsible for their lack of faith. So they throw him out of the synagogue, they reject him, but then he does something kind of odd. What does he do? This probably shouldn't make sense to you as a modern person. He goes to the house of Titus Justus, who lives next door. Now, one would think that if you got thrown out of the synagogue and you started preaching in the next door neighbor's house, the people in the synagogue can probably still hear you. Right? If you got thrown out of a church today, would you build a house right next door? But St. Paul goes to the house next door. And in the ancient world, the house next door very likely could have even shared the same wall as the synagogue. Because buildings were often like this agglomeration. It was just conjunction of things. Your wall of your house was often the wall of your neighbor's house too. Buildings were attached to each other. When they're made out of stone, you can do that a bit more readily, and they didn't build nearly as tall as they built out, because stone is heavy and getting it up to a second level is hard. But he goes to the house next door, and it notes that Crispus, who's a synagogue official, I should have looked this up in Greek what it actually says. Because the synagogue official, it seems like we should call them a rabbi. And I wonder if it's a similar word used for rabbi in the Gospels, but here they're saying synagogue official. But the leader of a synagogue was a rabbi, so I would think synagogue official is a rabbi. That makes sense to me. But Crispus is the synagogue official, and he and his family come to faith, so they're baptized. And then Paul has this vision, like we said earlier, of the Lord appearing to him. Now, it's most likely using the Lord, meaning the Lord Jesus, that Jesus appears to him. And he is told to go on speaking, to not be afraid, to reject a way of fear. And it's kind of funny because the vision says, I have many people in this city. And this is something where we have to rearrange our heads a little bit, because the church in Corinth probably wasn't like 10,000 people that Paul is a part of. Maybe it was a few hundred. But churches were small, especially at this time. They weren't the giant edifices that you think of in much of Europe. That's medieval Christianity and Baroque Christianity. Like, that comes much later. Churches in the early world like this were often house churches. People that were wealthy would allow the Christians to meet in their home. But none of you have a home that you could host Holy Spirit in, I don't think, right? Would any of you be willing to host Sunday Mass at your house? We wouldn't all fit like in your living room, right? Well, it's kind of the same thing in the ancient world. And so we have to reframe how we think about it a little bit, because I imagine all the time, like Paul's letter to the Corinthians, some massive church where pulls up a big scroll and reads out to lots of people. And it probably wasn't like that. It was probably much more, maybe a few hundred people. And that was considered a lot. And that the Lord has a lot of people in this place. He ends up staying for a year and a half, which is very different than some of the other places that he's been. I forget, there was one other city in Greece where I think it said he stayed for a year. But here he stays for a year and a half. So there must be some success in his mission. People must be responding. It can't all be Jewish people who are rejecting the message. It has to be at least somewhat people that are hearing and listening. So he starts training them. And then it notes that Gallio is this official, this Roman official in Achaia. This is the island that Corinth is on. So it's talking about the same place. He probably lived in Corinth. And the Jews bring charges against Paul that he's inducing people to worship contrary to the law. Now, which law is it contrary to? Jewish law. That would seem to be the most obvious answer, but that would be a weird charge to bring to a Roman official, because a Roman official isn't really going to care about Jewish law, right? Like, if you got accused of violating the laws of Hope Lutheran Church, you'd probably say, well, I don't go there. Okay, I broke their law. I broke the law in Iran. Great. I don't go to Iran. What is it to me? So they seem to have to be trying to convince him that Paul is not just breaking Jewish law, but that he's breaking Roman law. Because otherwise it's like, okay, you're stuffy that he broke your rules, so fix it. It's your responsibility. They're not Roman things. This is the same thing that was done to Jesus, that Jesus was falsely accused of breaking the law as well. In his case, it was that same kind of double entendre, where he was accused primarily of violating Jewish law, but also violating Roman law by declaring himself a king. And the Pharisees and the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem really pushed Pontius Pilate that Jesus was setting himself up as a king in opposition to Caesar. Now, Jesus very clearly rejected that way of operating, that his kingdom was not of this world. But that's what they charge him with. Here, they try the same thing. And Gallio's like, stop it, I don't care, you're jealous, and this is a religious dispute. You go debate theology in the synagogue, not in a Roman court. This has nothing to do with me. And then they get mad and they seize Sosthenes and they attack him. There's several possibilities. One of them could be that they're just upset and they're like the modern day rioters. You know, we've seen a lot of this where something happened, in a lot of cases that was unjust. You know, someone was attacked or killed by the police, and there's injustice in that. But you don't address the injustice by burning down the city. Like, that doesn't help, because at the end of the day, your city is burned down. That's not a solution to the problem. So it could be that kind of thing here, where they're just upset and they're enraged, and so they like grab anyone they can get their hands on and try beating them to death. Like, look at us, look what we're going to do if you don't listen to us. That's like a temper tantrum. That's something that 2-year-olds do. If you take away my food, I'm going to throw a fit. And you don't want me to throw a fit, so give me my food. And sometimes you just have to say, no. And yes, you can throw a temper tantrum, but no, you're not going to get what you want. That's not how this works. Otherwise, the kid that throws a temper tantrum starts to control you. And that's not a good mode of operation. So it could be that. It's probably more likely that he's one of these Christian converts from Judaism. He could be like a synagogue official, he could be another rabbi, he could be someone influential, and so they go after Sosthenes because they can't go after Paul. Incidentally enough, Paul later will note that some of his letters are like Paul, Sosthenes, and Timothy to the church in, Ephesus or something. So he seems to become a co-worker of Paul through this. But here you see a bit of Roman snobbery. Gallio sees them beating Sosthenes and decides he's not going to do anything about that either. He's just not all that involved. Now, some of it could be there were attitudes in the ancient Roman world that were relatively racist. Like, you're just a bunch of barbarians anyway. You're these Jewish idiots, so yeah, you behave like barbarians. It's not surprising to us. We don't need to intervene. Like, go barbarianize yourselves. So it could be that. There was definitely, the Romans looked down upon the Jews and the culture that they followed. It could be that he doesn't want to get involved in a political mess. Because one of the things that Rome doesn't like is conflict. Like, you're the governor of a province and your job is to keep the province in order. And if your province